Apothecary Castile made the calculation in 3 seconds. 2 brothers down, both mortally wounded. One had taken a lost cannon hit through the chest cavity, his primary and secondary hearts obliterated, third heart failing. The other had been caught by a tyrannid bioweapon, his organs dissolving from the inside as alien toxins liquefied everything between his ribs. Castile could save one. Maybe, if he worked fast and got lucky and the Emperor smiled on his efforts. Or he could save neither, could let both die quickly, and harvest their gene seed before the implants degraded. 3 seconds. That's how long it took to make the choice. "Peace, brothers," Castile said, kneeling beside them. "The Emperor calls you home." He didn't try to save them, didn't waste time on surgery or combat drugs or desperate medical intervention. He just drew his reductor, that cruel tool designed for one purpose, and went to work. The first extraction took 11 seconds. The reductor's rotating blades cut through ceramite, bone, and tissue with practiced efficiency. Found the progenoid glands, 2 of them, one in the throat, one in the chest, and removed them with surgical precision. The second brother was still conscious, still aware, watched with failing eyes as Castile moved from his dead battle brother to him. "Why?" the dying Marine whispered. Blood bubbled at his lips. "Why not try?" "Because trying would waste both your gene seed and his," Castile replied, positioning the reductor. "This way, at least something survives. But I'm still alive. Not for long. And your gene seed is more valuable than the 3 minutes you have left." The reductor's blades spun up. The dying Marine's scream cut off as Castile made the throat incision. Then the chest cavity. Efficient, practiced, cold. 14 seconds later, both progenoid glands were secured in cryostasis. 2 more gene seeds saved. 2 future space Marines preserved in the organs of brothers who just died untreated. Castile stood, maglocked the samples to his armor, and moved to the next casualty. There were 7 more brothers down in his visual range. He'd save maybe 2 if he prioritized medical intervention. Or he could harvest 6 if he just let them die. The math was brutal, but it was simple. Dead Marines could become new Marines. Living Marines were just individuals, resources that could be replaced. The gene seed was eternal. The brother carrying it was temporary. That's when Castile understood the most important truth of his calling. The most important truth every apothecary learned eventually, usually over the corpses of brothers they'd chosen not to save. Space Marines weren't the Imperium's most valuable warriors. Their gene seed was. The Marines themselves were just delivery vehicles, living containers for the precious genetic material that could create the next generation. And sometimes, often actually, the container was worth less than its contents. This is the story that nobody talks about. The dark calculus at the heart of the Adeptus Astartes. Before we go deeper, I need you to answer something honestly in the comments. If you were the apothecary, what would you have done? Tried to save one brother and lose both gene seeds? Or let them die and preserve the future? Because this isn't a hypothetical. This is the choice apothecaries make every single day. Drop your answer. Let's see who actually understands what the Astartes cost. Now let me show you why dead space Marines matter more than living ones. And why that calculus is both necessary and absolutely horrifying. Gene seed takes decades to produce. Most people don't know this. The propaganda talks about the Emperor's angels, about super soldiers defending humanity, about warriors who know no fear. It doesn't talk about the biological reality underneath. It doesn't mention the centuries-long investment that goes into creating each individual Astartes. It doesn't explain why chapters guard their gene seed with more ferocity than they guard their battle brothers. It takes approximately 5 to 10 years to create a single gene seed implant. Maybe longer, depending on the chapter and the quality of their genetic stock. That's years of careful cultivation in specialized facilities, of constant monitoring by apothecaries and tech priests, of ensuring the organ develops properly without mutation or degradation, of filtering out corruption, watching for signs of genetic drift, testing for compatibility. The progenoid glands, the organs that produce new gene seed, don't even mature until years after implantation. The throat gland matures after 5 years. The chest gland after 10. You can't rush the process. Can't force the biology. The implants mature on their own schedule, and until they're ready, they're worthless for creating new Marines. Then it takes another decade to implant that gene seed into a suitable aspirant. To perform the 19 surgeries that transform a human child into an Astartes. To condition the body to accept the modifications. To wait for the organs to integrate and activate. To ensure the neophyte's body doesn't reject the implants, that his genetics are compatible, that the transformation doesn't kill him. 20 years. Minimum. From the moment you harvest a progenoid gland to the moment you have a fully functional Space Marine ready for combat deployment. 2 decades of investment, resources, training, monitoring. Compare that to how long it takes to kill one. 3 seconds if the enemy gets lucky. A well-placed lost cannon shot. A power weapon through a helmet seal. A chain of explosives that overwhelms even ceramite armor. Space Marines are tough, but they're not invincible. They die every day, across 1,000 war zones, in battles nobody will remember. 20 years to make. 3 seconds to destroy. That's the math that makes corpses valuable. Because when a Marine dies, he's not just one warrior lost. He's carrying up to 2 progenoid glands, the throat and the chest implants that can grow new gene seed. If you can recover those glands before they degrade, before enemy fire destroys them or warp corruption taints them or the body's decay makes them unviable, you can create 2 new Marines. 2 replacements from 1 casualty. A net gain, at least in genetic terms. If you can't recover them, you've lost not just the warrior but his genetic legacy. Lost the ability to replace him. Lost ground in the eternal struggle to maintain chapter strength. Every gene seed lost is a permanent reduction in the chapter's capacity to create new warriors. There's no backup, no reserve stockpile that can compensate. Just a slow, inevitable decline toward extinction. So the calculation becomes simple even if it's monstrous. A living Marine might survive and keep fighting, might recover from his wounds and return to service. Or he might die anyway despite your best efforts, and in dying, take his gene seed with him. Destroyed by trauma, corrupted by toxins, lost because you spent precious seconds trying to save the brother instead of securing the implants. A dead Marine with harvestable gene seed is a guaranteed resource. A known quantity. 2 future warriors traded for 1 current casualty. Mathematically optimal. Strategically sound. Emotionally devastating. Apothecary Castiel had made that trade 17 times in his career before the day on Tyranid-infested Vorlix Prime. 17 brothers he could have tried to save but chose to harvest instead. Each time, the math supported the decision. Each time, the chapter gained gene seed it would have lost. Each time, the cold logic of resource management overrode the human impulse to save a dying comrade. Each time, Castiel had to live with the memory of brothers dying while he cut them open for spare parts. "You did the right thing," his chapter master had told him after the first time, after Castiel had spent 6 hours in the chapel, praying for forgiveness for letting a brother die untreated. The weight of that first harvest had nearly broken him. He'd stood over Brother Thurin's corpse, reductor still wet with blood, and wondered if he'd just murdered his own brother under the pretense of duty. "It doesn't feel right," Castiel had replied, his voice hollow. "It's not supposed to feel right. It's supposed to be necessary. We're not here to feel good about our choices. We're here to ensure the chapter survives. That means making decisions that prioritize the gene seed over the individual. That means accepting that sometimes the best way to honor a fallen brother is to ensure his death creates 2 new warriors to continue his legacy. But he was my brother. He trusted me to save him. I saw it in his eyes. That trust. That belief that I would do everything possible to keep him alive. And I betrayed that trust. I let him die." The chapter master had gripped his shoulder with surprising gentleness. "You didn't betray him. You transformed his death into something meaningful. Brother Thurun's gene seed will create 2 new Marines. They'll fight battles he'll never see. They'll defend worlds he'll never know exist. They'll carry his genetic legacy forward through centuries. That's not betrayal. That's the only form of immortality we can offer. It feels like murder. It is murder, of a kind. But it's murder in service of a larger survival. We kill the individual to preserve the collective. We sacrifice the present to ensure the future. That's what it means to be Astartes. That's the compact we made when we accepted the gene seed ourselves. We're not individuals who happen to fight together. We're a continuity, an unbroken chain of genetic legacy stretching back 10,000 years to the Emperor himself. It was logical. It was practical. It was absolutely correct from a resource management perspective. It also made Castile sick to think about, because there was a difference between knowing intellectually that gene seed was more valuable than individual lives, and actually making that choice in the field. Actually watching brothers die because you decided their future contribution mattered more than their present survival. Actually positioning your reductor over a still-living warrior and making the incisions while he screamed. The Codex Astartes was clear about apothecary priorities. Gene seed preservation came first. Casualty treatment came second. In situations where you couldn't do both, where resources were limited, time was constrained, or injuries were too severe, you chose preservation. Always, without exception, without mercy. But the Codex was written by Robert Guilliman 10,000 years ago. Written by a primarch who'd commanded legions numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Written by someone who understood logistics and resource management on a scale that dwarfed individual concerns. Written by someone who'd never had to look into a dying brother's eyes and explain why you weren't going to save him. Why his life mattered less than the organs inside him. The chapter maintained something called the Vault of Remnants. It was a sealed chamber deep in the fortress monastery's lowest levels, carved into the bedrock of the chapter's home world. Temperature controlled to within a fraction of a degree. Genetically warded against corruption and mutation. Protected by the most advanced security the Adeptus Mechanicus could provide. Gene-lock doors, automated defense servitors, purity seals that would incinerate anyone carrying a trace of warp taint. And inside, carefully organized in cryostasis units, were thousands of gene seed samples. Thousands of progenoid glands harvested from fallen brothers over centuries of warfare. Each one a potential future Marine. Each one proof that the chapter's genetic legacy transcended any individual warrior's death. Castile visited the vault monthly. It was part of his duties as chief apothecary. Check the samples. Verify genetic stability. Run purity tests to ensure nothing had degraded or mutated. Document any anomalies. Transfer viable samples to the cultivation chambers where they'd be prepared for implantation. Each sample had a designation, a number etched into the cryo unit's casing, a date of harvest logged in the chapter's records. And if you looked up that number in the archives, cross-referenced it with service records and battle reports, you'd find a name, a service history, a summary of battles fought and honors earned, a life reduced to data points. Sample 4721. Harvested M41.997. Battle of Cadmo's Ridge. Castile pulled up the record on his data slate. Battle Brother Thrain. 83 years of service. 214 confirmed kills. Fought in 37 separate campaigns across 9 war zones. Awarded the Marksman's Honor after single-handedly holding a breach against orc invaders for 6 hours. Mentioned twice in chapter Master Commendations. Died at the Battle of Cadmo's Ridge from catastrophic trauma sustained during defensive operations. That was the official record. Sanitized. Professional. Reduced to bullet points that captured nothing of who Thrain had been. The truth was different. Castile had been there. Had been 20 meters away when Thrain went down. His armor breached by orc weapons. Blood pooling beneath him in spreading puddles. Had heard Thrain's voice over the Vox, requesting medical assistance. First time calm. Professional. Apothecary Castile. Brother Thrain requesting medical support. Grid reference Delta 7-3. Second time less calm. Pain creeping into the words. Castile, I need assistance. Bleeding badly. Can't stop it. Third time desperate. Afraid. Please. Brother, please. I can't feel my legs. Can't. Emperor's mercy. Please help me. Castiel had been 20 meters away. Could have reached him in maybe 30 seconds if he'd moved immediately. Could have tried combat surgery right there in the battlefield. Probably would have failed. The injuries were catastrophic. Orc weapons had shredded most of Thrain's lower torso. But he could have tried. Could have given Thrain the dignity of an attempt. The respect of believing his life was worth the effort. Instead, Castiel had prioritized harvesting gene seed from two brothers who were already dead. Brothers who'd fallen minutes earlier. Their gene seed at optimal harvest window. Had made the calculation that securing known resources mattered more than a low-probability rescue attempt. That 2 guaranteed gene seeds in hand were worth more than 1 possible survival. By the time he reached Thrain, 47 seconds after that third, desperate plea, the brother was already gone. Bled out while waiting for help that had been 20 meters away but might as well have been on another planet. But his gene seed was preserved. Both progenoid glands recovered intact. Samples 4721 and 4722, now residing in the vault, waiting to be implanted into worthy aspirants. Those samples had since been used. Thrain's genetic legacy now lived in 2 young Marines serving in the 7th Company. Brother Kellyan and Brother Vost. Both good warriors. Both carrying implants that had once matured inside Thrain's body. Both completely unaware that they existed because an apothecary had chosen to let their genetic predecessor die rather than risk losing the gene seed. That's what haunted Castiel. Not that he'd made the wrong choice by every objective measure, he'd made the correct one. But that he'd probably made the right choice. That, in the cold arithmetic of chapter survival, letting Thrain die was optimal. Saved resources. Preserved the genetic future. Enabled the creation of 2 new warriors. Made Thrain's death meaningful in a way his survival never could have been. Because if Castiel had saved him, had spent those precious seconds on surgery instead of harvest, Thrain might have lived. But the 2 brothers whose gene seed Castiel was harvesting would have degraded past viability. Would have been lost. And the chapter would have been 2 gene seeds poorer. Mathematically, Thrain's death was necessary. Required. The only logical choice. That didn't make it any easier to live with. You look troubled, brother. Chaplain Mordrin had entered the vault silently. His passage through the gene-locked doors so quiet that only decades of combat instinct kept Castiel from flinching. Chaplains were good at that. Moving like shadows. Appearing when your thoughts were darkest. As if they could sense spiritual crisis the way sharks sensed blood in water. Just reviewing samples. Routine maintenance. You do this too often. Spend too much time here cataloging the dead. Walking among ghosts. It's not healthy, brother. Not even for one of us. Someone has to remember them. Has to know their names. These aren't just samples. They were people once. Warriors. Brothers. They deserve to be remembered as more than inventory numbers. They're just genetic material now. Just biological components waiting to be used. What they were doesn't matter. Only what they can become matters. That's the whole point of the gene seed. That's why we harvest. To transcend individual death and achieve collective immortality. It matters to me. Mordrin moved closer, his ceramite boots clicking softly on the vault's adamantium floor. He studied the cryo-unit Castiel was examining, read the designation etched into its surface. Sample 4721. Thrain. I remember him. Good warrior. Steady under fire. Held the line when others might have broken. The kind of Marine we need more of. The kind whose loss diminishes us. Then why didn't we save him? Why did I let him bleed out 20 meters away while I harvested corpses? Because we'd have lost the gene seed attempting it. You made the assessment. Calculated the probabilities. Determined that trying to save Thrain would likely result in his death anyway, plus the loss of 2 other gene seed samples that were already secured. And now we have 3 samples instead of 1. 3 future Marines instead of 1 survivor who might have died from his wounds regardless. Mordrin's voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone explaining obvious mathematics to a slow student. Thrain's sacrifice created the possibility of 2 more warriors. His gene seed has already been implanted, already matured. 2 new brothers now serve where 1 fell. How is that not a victory? How is that not exactly what we're supposed to do? It's a victory for the chapter. A victory for the gene seed. Not for Thrain. He died alone, bleeding, calling for help that never came. Died knowing he'd been abandoned. Died with my name on his lips, probably cursing it. Thrain was a Marine. He understood the cost. We all do. Every one of us knows that when we fall, the apothecary will make a choice. Save us or save the gene seed. And we accept that choice because we understand the larger picture. Understand that the chapter's survival matters more than any individual's life. Do we? Or do we just tell ourselves that to make the horror bearable? Do the new recruits really understand that when they beg for help, the apothecary might be calculating whether their gene seed is worth more than their life? That they might die watching us harvest their brothers instead of saving them? Mordrin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was softer, more human. No, they don't understand. Not really. Not until they've seen it happen. Not until they've watched an apothecary choose harvest over rescue. And by then, it's too late to change their minds. They're already Astartes. Already committed. Already part of the machine that grinds up individuals to preserve the collective. He placed a hand on Castiel's shoulder. You're not a murderer, brother. You're a pragmatist. You make hard choices so the chapter endures. That's not a sin. That's duty. That's service. That's the burden we bear so that humanity survives another generation. Then why does it feel like sin? Why can't I stand in this vault without feeling like I'm standing in a mass grave? Every sample here is a brother I failed to save. A warrior I reduced to components. A person I decided was worth more dead than alive. Because you're human. Or at least enough of you remains human that you still feel guilt. That's good, Castiel. That means you haven't lost yourself completely to the optimization. That means you still see these samples as people rather than just resources. But you can't let that guilt paralyze you. Can't let it make you hesitate when the next choice arrives. Because the next choice will arrive. Tomorrow or next week or next month. And you'll have to make the same calculation again. Castiel looked at the thousands of samples surrounding them. Row after row of cryo units, each containing the genetic legacy of a fallen warrior. Each one a brother who died so the chapter could continue. Each one proof that in the calculus of Astartes warfare, corpses were often more valuable than lives. How many of these did I harvest while the brother was still alive? He asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Had counted. Had catalogued. Had maintained a private record of every harvest performed on living tissue. Every brother whose death he'd watched without intervening. Mordrin didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. Measured. Does it matter? Does knowing the number change anything? Yes. It changes how I think about myself. Whether I'm a healer who sometimes has to make terrible choices, or an executioner who happens to have medical training. Whether I'm saving the chapter or just murdering brothers slowly. You're both. We all are. That's what it means to serve the Imperium. We're healers and killers and everything in between. We do what's necessary, even when necessary means watching brothers die so their genetics can be recycled. Even when necessary means choosing preservation over mercy. Mordrin moved toward the vault's exit. His business here apparently concluded. Come. The chapter master wants to speak with you. Another campaign. Another deployment. Another battlefield where you'll have to make these choices again. Where you'll measure the worth of lives in gene seed and act accordingly. Castiel sealed the cryo unit he'd been examining and followed. Behind him, thousands of samples waited in perfect stasis. Thousands of brothers reduced to biological components. Thousands of deaths that had meaning only because they'd created the possibility of future Marines. He wondered if they'd consider it a fair trade, if they'd accept that their deaths mattered more than their lives had, if they'd forgive him for choosing their gene seed over their survival. Probably not, but they weren't around to complain, weren't around to question the calculus, weren't around to demand answers or accountability. The gene seed was perfectly preserved. Perfectly viable, perfectly ready to create the next generation of warriors who'd eventually become samples themselves. That was the cycle. That was the machine. And Castile was one of its essential components, keeping it running with harvests performed on living and dead alike. It should have felt noble, should have felt like service, like sacrifice for a greater good. Instead, it just felt like slowly becoming a monster wearing white armor and calling it mercy. The Tyranid assault on Vorlix Prime was brutal even by Astartes standards. 3 hive ships had emerged from the void, each one a biomechanical nightmare the size of a small moon. Millions of bioforms descended in endless waves. Termagants and Hormagaunts, warriors and raveners, carnifexes that shook the ground with each step. An ocean of chitin and teeth and acid blood that crashed against the Imperial defenses like tidal waves against a seawall. The planet's PDF had lasted 4 hours. Then the guard regiments stationed in system, another 8 hours before they were overwhelmed. Then the local Astra Militarum reinforcements, wiped out in 2 days of brutal attrition. Which meant it was the Astartes' turn. Castile's chapter deployed 2 full companies. 200 Marines against millions of Xenos. By any reasonable military calculation, the math should have been suicide. 200 warriors, no matter how enhanced, against an enemy that could field 1,000 bioforms for every defender. Instead, it was just extremely costly. The first brother fell 4 minutes into the engagement. Brother Sergeant Vrax, a veteran of 60 years, caught by a Tyranid warrior form that had gotten past his guard. The bioweapon punched through his armor with shocking ease. Those weapons evolved between battles, adapted to penetrate whatever armor they encountered, and ruptured everything important. Hearts, lungs, gene seed glands, all damaged beyond immediate repair. Vrax hit the ground and didn't move again. Dead before the impact, his enhanced physiology unable to compensate for the catastrophic damage. Castile reached him in 20 seconds, moving through the battlefield with an apothecary's practiced efficiency, dodging fire, stepping over Tyranid corpses, reaching the fallen brother while his gene seed was still viable. He did a quick assessment with his Narthetium's bioscanner. Multiple organ failure, massive blood loss, 0 brain activity. No possibility of survival even with immediate surgical intervention and full life support. Easy choice. The reductor came out. That terrible device that every apothecary carried, designed for one purpose and one purpose only. Not healing, not surgery, just harvest. Efficient extraction of gene seed from fallen brothers, living or dead, with minimal damage to the precious genetic material. 15 seconds later, 2 progenoid glands were secured in the reductor's built-in cryostorage. Samples logged. Position marked for armor recovery. The ceramite was valuable too, could be reclaimed and refitted for new warriors. The brother's body was left where it fell. They'd collect it later if possible, give him the honor of cremation or burial depending on chapter traditions. But for now, the gene seed was secured. The mission was accomplished. Castile moved to the next casualty, his armor systems already identifying another fallen brother 30 meters northeast. The second brother was still alive. Barely. Brother Callus, assault marine, caught by a gargoyle that had hit him from above. The flying Tyranid's bioweapon had punched through his gorget, one of the few weak points in Mark 7 plate, and severed his spinal column at the base of the skull. Paralyzed from the neck down. Couldn't move. Could barely breathe, his paralyzed diaphragm struggling to function. Brother Castile, Callus gasped, his voice distorted through damaged Vox grill. I can't feel anything. My limbs won't respond. Castile scanned quickly with his Narthetium. The readings confirmed what he'd suspected. Complete spinal severance at C1 vertebra. Neurological damage too severe for field treatment. Even if they evacuated immediately, even if they had access to the finest Mechanicus augmetics in the galaxy, Callus would never fight again. Would spend the rest of his life as a crippled invalid, dependent on life support and cybernetics, unable to serve in any combat capacity. Unless the gene seed was still viable. Both progenoids intact, undamaged by the injury, could be harvested now, while the brother's biology was still maintaining them. While his enhanced metabolism was still functioning well enough to preserve the implants, or Castile could try to stabilize him. Spend precious time on medical intervention that would ultimately fail. Watch the gene seed degrade as the brothers' systems shut down. Risk losing both the warrior and his genetic legacy. I need you to trust me, Castile said, positioning the reductor. The Marine's eyes, visible through his cracked visor, showed sudden fear. Not of death. Astartes were trained to accept death. But of understanding. Of realizing what Castile was about to do. Please, Callus whispered. Not like this. Don't harvest me while I'm still breathing. Let me die as a warrior, not a resource to be mined. Your spine is severed. Your autonomic systems are failing. You'll be dead in 3 minutes regardless of what I do. The only question is whether those 3 minutes mean we preserve your gene seed or lose it. Then let me have those 3 minutes. Let me die with dignity. Let me feel like my death has meaning beyond just being spare parts. Castile hesitated. 3 minutes. That was all the brother was asking for. 3 minutes to feel human before the end. 3 minutes to die as a warrior rather than livestock being processed for useful components. But 3 minutes meant the gene seed might start degrading. The spinal damage was severe enough that it could affect blood flow to the progenoid glands. There was risk, small but real, that waiting would compromise the harvest. That they'd lose not just the warrior but his genetic legacy. The codex was clear. Gene seed preservation came first. Always. Without exception. Without mercy. I'm sorry, brother, Castile said, and activated the reductor. The Marine screamed. Not from physical pain. The nerve damage meant he couldn't feel anything below his neck. Couldn't sense the reductor's blades cutting through his armor and flesh. But from horror. From the realization that his final moments were being stolen from him. That he was dying not as a warrior in the Emperor's service but as a resource being harvested. As livestock. As a container for valuable components that mattered more than the person carrying them. 21 seconds. That's how long it took to extract both progenoid glands. 21 seconds of Callus screaming voicelessly, his paralyzed lungs unable to produce more than strangled gasps, while Castile methodically cut him open and removed his most valuable organs. The throat gland first. Quick incision through the damaged gorget. Expose the thyroid region. Locate the progenoid nestled beside the larynx. Extract with minimal tissue damage. 10 seconds. Then the chest gland. Harder access, required cutting through more armor and tissue, but the gland was large and easy to locate once you open the thoracic cavity. 11 seconds including sealing and cryostorage. When it was done, when both gene seeds were secured in their preservation units, Castile looked down at Callus's face. The Marine was still alive, still conscious, still aware of what had just been done to him. His eyes held something Castile had never seen before in an Astartes. Not fear, not pain, but betrayal. Complete, absolute betrayal. The Emperor. Callus tried to speak. Blood bubbled at his lips, leaked from the incision in his throat. The Emperor will judge you. I hope he does, Castile replied, his voice flat. Because I can't justify this to myself anymore. Can't explain why your 3 final minutes mattered less than the risk to your gene seed. Can't reconcile being a healer with being this. Callus died 30 seconds later, his paralyzed body finally giving up. Castile marked his position for armor recovery and moved on. There was no time for reflection. No space for guilt. Just the next casualty. The next harvest. The next calculation of life versus gene seed. 3 more brothers fell in the next hour as the Tyrannid assault intensified. Brother Theron, Devastator Marine, caught by a Carnifex's crushing claws. The massive Bio-Titan had grabbed him mid-fire, squeezed until his armor crumpled like parchment, then discarded the broken body. Everything below his ribs was paste. Gene seed intact. Harvest took 18 seconds. Brother Caius, Tactical Marine, hit by a Tyrannid warrior's bone saber. The blade had penetrated through a joint seal, carved through his torso diagonally from shoulder to hip. Still alive when Castile reached him, consciousness fading. Didn't even have time to beg. Gene Seed recovered in 16 seconds while he watched with dying eyes. Brother Ven, Scout Sergeant, swarmed by Rippers. Dozens of the small bioforms had pulled him down, their teeth finding every joint and seal in his lighter scout armor. By the time Castile reached him, Ven was mostly consumed. But the gene seed was still intact. Rippers didn't target specific organs, just devoured randomly. Extraction took 23 seconds, complicated by the need to drive off the remaining bioforms while working. By hour 3, Castile had 14 samples secured. 14 brothers dead. 14 future Marines preserved in cryostasis. Their genetic potential saved even as their lives were lost. The battle raged around him. Bolter fire and bioweapon discharges creating a constant cacophony. Marines fighting and dying in a desperate holding action against an enemy that seemed infinite. Tyranids swarming and being cut down and swarming again in endless waves. Each loss meaningless to the hive mind because there were always more. And through it all, Castile did his job. Not saving brothers, there was no time for that, no resources, no possibility of meaningful medical intervention in the middle of a battlefield. Just harvesting them. Moving from corpse to corpse like a farmer gathering crops. Efficient. Mechanical. Optimized for maximum genetic recovery. He should have felt something. Horror at what he was doing. Guilt at the brothers he was letting die. Remorse for the lives he was valuing only as gene seed delivery systems. But there was no time for feelings. No space between casualties for emotional processing. No moment to pause and reflect on the moral weight of his actions. Just the next body. The next harvest. The next addition to the chapter's genetic reserves. It was, in its own horrible way, the purest expression of Astartes' pragmatism. The reduction of complex human beings to biological components. The optimization of resource recovery. The cold calculus of survival that valued genetic potential over individual existence. At hour 5, something changed. Something that would haunt Castile for the rest of his long life. He reached a fallen brother. Designation unknown. The Vox identification system was damaged by Tyranid biointerference, and found him still conscious, still aware. Gut wound from a Tyranid ranged bioweapon, the organic projectile having punched through his armor and detonated inside his abdominal cavity, spilling organs onto the ground in steaming loops. Apothecary? The Marine gasped. His voice tight with pain even his post-human physiology couldn't fully suppress. Need. Extraction, medical extraction. Castile scanned automatically, his narthecium providing detailed biometric data within seconds. Massive trauma. Multiple organ failures. Both the oolitic kidney and the multilung were destroyed. Preomner ruptured. Intestines shredded. Catastrophic blood loss that even the Laraman's organ couldn't compensate for. But the wounds were lower body. The gene seeds, throat and chest were completely intact. Undamaged. Perfect for harvest. Help me, the Marine whispered, reaching up with one shaking hand. Please, don't leave me. Castile knelt beside him, looked into the brother's eyes, pale blue, visible through the cracked visor. Young eyes. This was a new Marine, maybe 30 years of service. Still believed in the propaganda. Still thought the apothecary's job was healing. I can't, Castile said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion because emotion would make this impossible. Your injuries are too severe. Evacuation would take resources we don't have. Surgery would take time we don't have. You're already dead, brother. Your body just doesn't know it yet. Then kill me. Mercy kill. Make it quick. Don't leave me to die slowly. I can do better than that, Castile replied, drawing the reductor. I can make your death mean something. Make it count for something beyond just one more casualty. The Marine's eyes widened as he saw the tool, recognized it, understood what it meant. No, please. Don't harvest me. I'm still alive. Still fighting. Still dying. And your gene seed is viable. Perfect condition. Can create 2 new brothers to replace you. That's better than a mercy kill. That's legacy. That's immortality of a kind. I don't want immortality. The Marine's voice rose to a scream. I want to live. I want to fight. I want to die as a warrior, not as spare parts. But Castiel ignored him, made the incisions with practiced efficiency, extracted the implants while the brother screamed and thrashed and begged, added them to his collection. The Marine was still alive when he finished, still breathing, still staring up at the smoke-filled sky with eyes that held nothing but betrayal and horror. "You'll thank me later," Castiel said, though he didn't believe it. Didn't believe the brother would ever understand. Didn't believe there was any way to make this seem like anything other than what it was, the reduction of a living person to harvestable components. "I'm alive," the Marine whispered, his voice broken. "Still alive. And you just harvested me, cut me open and took what you wanted. Like I'm already dead. Like I don't matter anymore. You are dead. Your body just hasn't accepted it yet. This way, at least your death creates something. 2 new Marines from your gene seed. Legacy. Continuation. That's the best any of us can hope for." The Marine didn't respond, just stared at the sky while his life bled out onto the scorched earth of Vorlix Prime. Castiel moved on, left the brother lying there, eviscerated, his gene seed stolen while he was still technically alive. Left him to die slowly or be consumed by Tyranids. Whichever came first. He didn't look back. Couldn't afford to. There were more casualties, more harvests, more choices between life and gene seed. And he chose gene seed. Every time. Without hesitation. Because that was the job. That was duty. That was what kept the chapter alive even as individual brothers died. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't even particularly efficient from a pure medical standpoint. But it was necessary. And in the calculus of Astartes warfare, necessary always won. Even when necessary meant becoming a monster. The battle ended after 9 hours of continuous combat. The Tyranids were driven back. Not defeated, you never truly defeated the high fleets, just damaged them enough to make continued assault tactically inadvisable. But pushed to the point where the hive mind calculated that further casualties outweighed potential biomass gains. They'd retreated to their ships, withdrawn to digest their gains and adapt to the tactics they'd encountered. They would return, stronger, better adapted, with bioforms specifically evolved to counter Astartes' weapons and tactics. But not today. Today, the Imperium held Vorlix Prime. The cost was 47 Marines. Nearly a quarter of the 200 Marine deployment. 47 brothers who'd stood against the alien tide and been swept away. Who'd fought to their last breath defending a world most of them had never seen before and would now never see again. 47 warriors lost. 47 holes in the chapter's order of battle. 47 empty suits of armor waiting to be reclaimed and refitted. But Castiel had secured 81 gene seed samples. 47 sets of matched progenoids, both throat and chest glands from each casualty, plus additional samples from brothers whose bodies had been recovered intact enough for full harvest. Some brothers yielded only one viable gland, damaged by whatever killed them. But others yielded both, and in a few cases, Castiel had recovered samples from brothers who'd fallen early in the battle and been preserved by the cold environment. 81 samples from 47 losses. That was 64% genetic recovery rate. Well above chapter average. Exceptional by any measure. The chapter master reviewed the numbers with clear approval, standing in the command center of their flagship while tactical displays showed the retreating Tyranid fleet. Exceptional work, Apothecary. 81 samples from 47 losses. That's 17% better than our usual recovery rate. Well above Codex recommendations. You've preserved more genetic material than we lost, which means this battle was actually a net gain for the chapter's long-term strength. Yes, Master, Castiel replied, his voice flat. Something troubles you? You should be pleased. You've done your duty admirably. Secured the chapter's future. Ensured that today's losses can be replaced with 2 or more new brothers. How many of those 47 could I have saved if I'd prioritized treatment over harvest? The chapter master's expression hardened. Irrelevant question. Your job isn't to save individuals. It's to preserve the chapter's genetic heritage. By that measure, The only measure that matters, you performed perfectly. And by the measure of brotherhood? Of our oaths to protect each other? Of the trust brothers place in the apothecary to at least try to save them. We're not brothers first, apothecary. We're Marines first. Components of a larger war machine. Our brotherhood is important. Bonds of trust and camaraderie make us more effective fighters, but it's subordinate to our function, to our purpose. Which is survival. Chapter Survival. Gene seed preservation. Ensuring that when we fall, we can be replaced. That's the priority. Everything else, brotherhood, honor, individual glory, comes second. Has to come second, or we become too attached to individuals and lose sight of the larger mission. Castile wanted to argue, wanted to insist that there had to be a balance, that you couldn't reduce warriors to genetic components without losing something essential, without transforming the Astartes from heroes into machines that happened to be made of meat. But the numbers didn't lie. 81 samples from 47 casualties. Nearly 2 progenoids per loss. 47 brothers who died but whose genetic legacy would create 94 new Marines, assuming successful implantation. Nearly 2 replacements per casualty. From a resource perspective, from a strategic standpoint, from a purely mathematical analysis, the battle had been a net gain for the chapter. They'd lost ground forces but gained genetic potential. Traded present strength for future capability. I let brothers die while they begged for help, Castile said quietly, his voice barely audible over the command center's background noise. I harvested them like crops. Took their gene seed while they were still breathing, still conscious. Some of them died cursing my name, died believing I'd betrayed them. And their gene seed will create the warriors who replace them, who'll fight battles they'll never see, who'll defend humanity using implants taken from their bodies. The chapter master stood, moved to the viewport where Vorlix Prime rotated slowly. That's the calculus, apothecary. That's what we chose when we became Astartes. We're not individuals who happen to fight together. We're a continuity, a genetic legacy that transcends any single warrior. Your job is to maintain that continuity, to ensure that death isn't final, that fallen brothers live on through their genetic contribution. But we're still people, still human at least partially, still capable of feeling betrayed when the apothecary watches us die so he can harvest our organs. Are we? Or are we machines that happen to be made of meat instead of metal? The chapter master turned to face him. The Mechanicus builds new tanks from the salvage of destroyed ones, reclaims parts, refits them, sends them back into battle. How is what you do any different? You salvage genetic material from destroyed Marines and use it to create new ones. Different body. Same gene seed. Continuity maintained. Castile had no answer, because the chapter master was right. What he did, harvesting gene seed from fallen brothers, was functionally identical to scavenging parts from wrecked vehicles. Different materials, different emotional weight, but same basic logic, same resource management principles. Get some rest, the chapter master ordered. Medical teams will handle body recovery and armor salvage. Your job is done for now. We deploy again in 48 hours. Different war zone, same mission. And you'll make the same choices. You'll harvest brothers while they beg for mercy. You'll prioritize gene seed over individuals. Because that's your duty. Because that's what preserves the chapter. Castile left the command chamber and walked through the ship's corridors. Past brothers who nodded respectfully, their casual greetings a stark contrast to the weight crushing his chest. Warriors who trusted that if they fell, the apothecary would try to save them. Who believed their lives mattered to the chapter beyond just their genetic contribution. They didn't know, didn't understand that saving them might mean letting them die untreated so their gene seed could be harvested optimally. That the apothecary they trusted with their lives was trained to view them as resources first and people second. That corpses were often more valuable than living warriors. He reached his quarters and sealed the door. Stood before the small shrine. Every Marine maintained one, even those who'd stopped believing in anything years ago, and tried to pray. The words wouldn't come, because how do you pray when you've spent 9 hours harvesting brothers like crops? When you've listened to dying Marines beg for mercy and cut them open instead. When you've reduced the Emperor's angels to spare parts waiting to be extracted. The Emperor protects. That's what they taught. What they drilled into every recruit from day one. The Emperor protects his servants. The Emperor watches over his warriors. The Emperor cares for his chosen. But the Emperor hadn't protected those 47 brothers. Hadn't saved them from tyrannid claws and bioweapons. Hadn't intervened when they fell. And Castiel hadn't even tried. He just measured their worth in gene seed and harvested accordingly. Made the calculations. Extracted the implants. Added them to the chapter's genetic reserves. This is wrong, he said aloud to the empty room. This has to be wrong. We can't just reduce warriors to genetic components. Can't value death over life. Can't become so obsessed with preservation that we forget what we're preserving. But wrong or right didn't matter. The chapter needed gene seed. The gene seed required harvest. And harvest sometimes required letting brothers die. Required choosing genetic legacy over individual survival. That was the calculus. That was the cost. That was what it meant to be an apothecary in the Adeptus Astartes. And Castiel would pay it again tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. For as long as the chapter needed him to be the monster who harvested the dead. Because that's what apothecaries were. Not healers. Not saviors. Not protectors. Scavengers. Butchers wearing white armor and calling it mercy. Harvesters who measured the worth of brothers in progenoid glands and made choices no one should have to make. And if that made him a monster, if that corrupted something essential about what it meant to be Astartes, then so be it. The chapter would survive. The gene seed would be preserved. The genetic legacy would continue. That had to be enough. Had to justify the horror. Had to make the sacrifices meaningful. Because if it wasn't enough, if 47 dead brothers and 81 harvested gene seeds didn't mean something, then Castiel had just spent 9 hours committing atrocities for nothing. And that was a possibility he couldn't afford to consider. Not if he wanted to do this again tomorrow. The Codex Astartes devotes 17 pages to gene seed preservation protocols. It devotes 4 pages to battlefield casualty treatment. That ratio tells you everything you need to know about Astartes' priorities. The gene seed matters more than the Marine carrying it. The future matters more than the present. The chapter's continuity matters more than individual survival. The text is explicit about this, though most brothers never read those sections carefully. Never analyze what the Codex is really saying beneath its clinical language and tactical recommendations. Castiel sat in the Apothecarian 3 days after Vorlix Prime, reviewing the Codex for the 1000th time. Looking for loopholes. For exceptions. For any clause that would let him prioritize saving brothers over harvesting them. For some passage he'd missed in 300 years of service that would justify choosing individual survival over genetic preservation. He found none. The Codex was clear. Brutally, explicitly clear. Gene seed preservation came first. Always. In every situation. Without exception. Without compromise. Section 17.4. In situations where the apothecary must choose between casualty stabilization and gene seed recovery, recovery takes priority. The individual Marine's survival is secondary to the preservation of his genetic legacy. Section 17.9. Optimal harvest window for progenoid extraction begins at point of critical injury and extends approximately 30 standard minutes post-mortem. Apothecaries should prioritize harvest within this window even if the subject remains technically alive. Technically alive. The Codex used that phrase, as if there was a difference between being alive and being technically alive. As if consciousness and awareness were just inconvenient details that shouldn't interfere with efficient resource extraction. You're torturing yourself again. Chief Librarian Talos had entered the Apothecarian without knocking. Psychers could be rude that way, their psychic senses telling them when their presence was needed regardless of whether it was wanted. I can feel your turmoil from 3 decks away. Your thoughts are loud enough to disturb my meditation. Just reviewing protocols. Ensuring I understand my duties correctly. Looking for permission to feel human. You won't find it in the Codex. Gilliman didn't write it for humans. He wrote it for posthumans. For warriors who'd transcended individual survival instinct and accepted their role as components in a larger system. As parts of a machine that outlives any individual member. But we're still partly human. Still capable of guilt and doubt and all the things that make this job unbearable. Still capable of feeling like monsters when we harvest living brothers. Yes, and that's by design. Talos sat across from him, his psychic hood casting strange shadows in the apothecarian's dim lighting. If apothecaries were fully transhuman, if they felt nothing while harvesting brothers, no guilt or hesitation or moral weight, they'd become too efficient. Would start harvesting the living without proper justification. Would make the calculations purely on resource optimization without considering the human cost. The guilt keeps you honest. Makes you hesitate just enough to avoid becoming a butcher who harvests brothers for convenience rather than necessity. I already am a butcher. I harvest living Marines. I watch them die while I cut them open. I prioritize their gene seed over their lives. How is that different from what you're describing? Context, justification, the awareness that what you're doing is monstrous even when it's necessary. A true butcher wouldn't care, wouldn't feel anything, would just harvest efficiently and move to the next casualty. You're not that. You're a pragmatist who occasionally has to butcher. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one. Castile closed the codex, the ancient tome's pages settling with a sound like a sigh. Do you know how many brothers I've harvested while they were still alive? While they begged me not to. While they screamed and cursed and called me traitor. While they looked at me with eyes that held nothing but betrayal. No, but I know it's non-zero. Because that's the job. Because sometimes the optimal time to harvest is while the brother is still technically alive. While his biology is still maintaining the gene seed. While his enhanced metabolism is still functioning well enough to preserve the implants. Death begins degradation. Harvest before death prevents degradation. The logic is simple even if the ethics are horrifying. They teach us that in training. Optimal harvest window begins at critical injury and extends 30 minutes post-mortem. 30 minutes. We're taught to view our brothers as having a 30-minute window where they're useful for parts. Where their bodies are still fresh enough to yield viable gene seed. After that, they're just corpses. Waste. Resources we failed to recover in time. Would you prefer we waste gene seed? Let it degrade because we waited too long? Let sentiment and squeamishness cost us the ability to replace fallen brothers? Every gene seed lost is a Marine who'll never exist. A warrior who'll never fight. A defender humanity will never have. How many worlds fall because we're too gentle to harvest efficiently? I'd prefer we didn't have to make the choice. But we do. Every day. Every battle. Save the brother or save the gene seed. Try to heal or harvest immediately. Risk losing both or guarantee preserving one. And we always choose the gene seed. Talos leaned back in his chair, his ancient features thoughtful. Let me tell you something they don't teach in apothecary training. Something I learned from reading the chapter's oldest records, the ones sealed in the librarius that most brothers never see. The histories that document not just our victories but our mistakes. Do you know what happens to chapters that prioritize individual survival over gene seed preservation? No. They die. Slowly. Over centuries. They lose more gene seed than they can replace. Their numbers dwindle. They take casualties in battle and can't recover enough implants to maintain recruitment rates. Eventually, they fall below minimum strength, unable to field a full company, unable to accept certain deployments, unable to maintain their fortress monasteries. And then the administratum steps in. The High Lords declare them unable to fulfill their oaths. And they get absorbed by other chapters or disbanded entirely. The genetic legacy is lost. Centuries or millennia of service erased. All because they valued individual survival over genetic preservation. So we sacrifice individuals to preserve the collective. We sacrifice individuals to preserve the ability to create individuals. That's different. If we didn't harvest, if we tried to save every brother regardless of cost to gene seed preservation, we'd run out of Marines. The attrition would overwhelm us. The chapter would collapse. And then who would defend the Imperium in our place? Who would fight the battles we're equipped to fight? Who would carry our specific genetic legacy and capabilities? Someone else. Other chapters. The Guard. The galaxy is full of warriors. We're not unique. Not irreplaceable. No. Talos' eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement or might have been sorrow. Tell that to the worlds we've saved. The campaigns we've won. The enemies we've destroyed that no one else could have defeated. Every chapter has its specialty. Its unique capabilities derived from its gene seed and traditions. What you preserve with each harvest is unique. Irreplaceable. Worth more than any single warrior's life because it enables the creation of countless future warriors. It was the same argument the chapter master had made. The same logic that justified every harvest. Every choice to let a brother die untreated so his gene seed could be recovered. Every decision to prioritize genetic material over living, breathing, conscious warriors. And it was correct. Logically, factually, strategically correct. The math supported it. The history validated it. The codex mandated it. It was also horrifying. How do you live with it? Castiel asked, and he wasn't asking about the logic anymore. Wasn't questioning the necessity. Was asking something deeper. Something about the soul, if Astartes even had such a thing. How do any of us live with being reduced to components? To being valued more dead than alive? To knowing that when we fall, the apothecary might choose to harvest us rather than save us? That our final moments might be spent watching someone cut us open for parts? We don't live with it. We exist with it. There's a difference. Talos stood, moved to the apothecarian's viewing port where the void stretched infinite and cold. Living implies joy, satisfaction, contentment. A sense of purpose that fulfills rather than hollows. Existing is just continuing, persisting, doing your duty regardless of how it makes you feel, regardless of what it costs your humanity or your soul. That sounds like hell. It is, but it's necessary hell. Someone has to do this job. Someone has to make the terrible calculations. Someone has to stand over dying brothers and decide whether to save them or harvest them. And it can't be someone who's too human to function, who'd break down after the first harvest and refuse to do it again. But it also can't be someone who's so inhuman they don't care, who'd harvest without proper assessment, who'd kill brothers unnecessarily just for efficiency. It has to be someone who feels the weight of every choice but makes the choice anyway. Someone who's human enough to suffer but transhuman enough to function. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you. That's why you're chief apothecary. Not because you're the best surgeon or the most knowledgeable medical practitioner, but because you can make the terrible choices and continue. Can harvest brothers while hating yourself for it and still return to the battlefield the next day. Can live or exist with the weight of all those deaths and keep functioning. Talos turned from the viewport. The next deployment is tomorrow. Orc incursion on a forge world. Heavy casualties expected. Orcs don't use precision weapons, they just overwhelm through numbers and violence. You'll make the same choices again. Harvest brothers who could maybe be saved if you prioritize treatment. Let warriors die while you secure their gene seed. Watch the life fade from their eyes while you cut them open. And you'll hate yourself for it. I already hate myself. Good. That means you're still human enough to be trusted with the reductor. The day you stop hating yourself is the day we should take it away. The day you harvest without feeling anything is the day you become the monster you're afraid of being. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. You asked how we live with being valued more dead than alive. We don't. We just accept it. Accept that we're not individuals first, we're gene seed carriers first. Walking repositories for the genetic material that will create our replacements. Our lives matter, but they matter less than our genetic legacy. That's the compact we made when we accepted the gene seed. When we became Astartes. We became part of something larger than ourselves. Something that transcends individual existence and continues through death and rebirth and death again. That's not service. That's slavery. We're slaves to our own genetic material. Perhaps, but it's slavery with purpose. Slavery that preserves humanity. Slavery that ensures the Imperium has defenders capable of fighting its wars. You can call it whatever you want. The result is the same. We serve, we fight, we die. And we hope that when we die, the apothecary harvests sufficiently so our death creates 2 new brothers instead of just reducing the chapter by 1. Talos left. The apothecarian fell silent except for the hum of medical equipment and the distant vibration of the ship's engines. Castiel sat alone with the codex and his thoughts and the memory of 47 dead brothers, whose gene seed now waited in the vault for implantation. He wondered if they'd forgive him, if they'd understand that his choices were dictated by doctrine and necessity, if they'd accept that their deaths were transformed into something meaningful by the preservation of their genetic legacy. Probably not, but they weren't around to express their opinions, weren't around to call him monster or murderer or traitor. The gene seed was perfectly preserved, perfectly viable, perfectly ready to create new warriors who'd eventually face the same choices, who'd eventually become corpses more valuable than living brothers. That was the cycle. That was the machine. And Castiel was one of its essential components, keeping it running with harvests performed on living and dead alike. It should have felt noble, should have felt like service, like sacrifice for a greater good. Instead, it just felt like slowly becoming a monster wearing white armor and calling it duty. 50 years later, Castiel stood in the Vault of Remnants for the last time. He was old now, by Astartes standards, which meant ancient by any human measure. 347 years of service. 219 campaigns across 37 different war zones. Thousands of brothers harvested. Tens of thousands of gene seeds preserved. More death than most mortals could comprehend, reduced to numbers in a ledger and samples in cryostorage. The vault had grown since his early days. The chamber had been expanded twice, carved deeper into the fortress monastery's bedrock to accommodate the growing collection. More samples, more cryo units, more brothers reduced to genetic components and catalogued for future use. Each one a warrior who'd served and died and been harvested. Each one proof that the system worked, that the calculus was correct, that corpses really were more valuable than lives. He found sample 4721, using the vault's catalog system to locate the specific cryo unit. Thrain's gene seed, the first harvest where he'd consciously chosen to let a brother die untreated. The first time he'd made the calculation and prioritized preservation over salvation. The sample was gone, used decades ago. Implanted into an aspirant who'd become a full Marine and served for 60 years before falling to a Tyranid swarm during the Third Vorlix's defense. His gene seed had been harvested in turn, recovered by another apothecary, added back to the vault. Samples 9847 and 9848. Thrain's genetic legacy, continuing through death and rebirth and death again. An unbroken chain of warriors, each carrying pieces of the original. Each adding their own service to the tradition, each eventually becoming samples themselves, waiting in cryostorage for the next generation. It should have felt meaningful, should have proven that the sacrifices mattered, that letting brothers die to preserve gene seed was worth it because the genetic legacy continued, because Thrain wasn't truly dead. He lived on through his implants, through the warriors who carried his genetic material, through the unbroken chain of service that stretched from his death to the present and beyond. Instead, it just felt empty, because Thrain was still dead. The warrior who'd carried that gene seed originally, who'd earned honors and fought battles and been someone rather than something, was gone. Reduced to a genetic sample that could be copied and reused but never truly recovered. The person was lost. Only the biology remained, and Castiel had made that choice. Had prioritized harvesting corpses over saving lives, had let Thrain bleed out 20 meters away while securing gene seed from brothers who were already gone. Apothecary Castiel. A young voice. Castiel turned and saw a new apothecary, fresh from the chapter's training programs. Eager eyes that hadn't seen real war yet. Clean white armor that bore no battle damage. Hands that had never held a reductor over a living brother and made the choice to harvest instead of heal. Brother, Castiel acknowledged. I'm to replace you. Take over as chief apothecary. The chapter master said you could provide guidance. about the role, about the responsibilities, about what's required. Castiel studied the young Marine, saw himself 3 centuries ago, saw the same dedication, the same belief that being an apothecary meant saving brothers, the same conviction that medical training existed to preserve life rather than harvest death. He wondered how long it would take before that belief died, before the reductor became more familiar than the narthecium, before harvest became easier than healing, before the young apothecary stood in this same vault, decades later, wondering if he'd become a monster. The first time you let a brother die to preserve his gene seed, Castiel said quietly, his voice heavy with centuries of accumulated guilt, you'll hate yourself. The guilt will be overwhelming. You'll pray for forgiveness, question your choices, wonder if you're still a healer or if you've become something worse. Something monstrous wearing white armor and pretending it's mercy. And does it get better? Does the guilt fade? Do you eventually accept it as necessary? No, it gets worse. Because eventually you'll make the calculation automatically. Won't even hesitate. Will see a fallen brother and immediately assess harvest viability before considering treatment options. Your first thought won't be, how do I save him? But, are his gene seeds recoverable? And that's when you'll realize you've changed. That you've become the thing you were afraid of becoming. That you're no longer a healer who occasionally harvests. You're a harvester who occasionally heals. The young apothecary looked disturbed, his eagerness fading into something that might have been doubt. Is there any other way? Any alternative to this calculus? No, this is the way. This is what the chapter needs. What the Imperium requires. What the codex mandates. And you'll do it because duty demands it. Because gene seed preservation matters more than individual survival. Because we're not people first, we're resources. Components in a larger machine that needs maintenance and replacement. Living vessels for genetic material that's more valuable than the lives carrying it. That's horrifying, yes, but also necessary. Because if we don't make these choices, the chapter dies. The gene seed is lost. And everything we've fought for becomes meaningless. Every battle we've won. Every world we've saved. All of it collapses if we can't replace our losses. If we can't maintain our numbers. And the only way to maintain numbers is to harvest efficiently. To prioritize preservation over salvation. To accept that corpses are more valuable than lives. Castiel turned back to the vault, to the thousands of samples representing thousands of dead brothers. Each one a warrior who'd been reduced to genetic components. Each one proof that corpses were more valuable than lives. Each one a testament to the calculus that had governed his entire career. Your job, he told the young apothecary, his voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of service, is to ensure this vault keeps growing, that when brothers fall, their gene seed survives, that the chapter continues regardless of individual cost, regardless of how many warriors you have to watch die, regardless of how many times you position your reductor over a living brother and make the cuts while he begs you not to. You'll make terrible choices. You'll harvest brothers who plead for mercy. You'll prioritize the future over the present. You'll become efficient at death in ways that would disgust the person you were before you took up the reductor. And you'll hate yourself for it. You'll stand in this vault decades from now, surrounded by thousands of samples, and wonder if any of it was worth the cost to your soul. But I'll do it anyway, the young apothecary said quietly, beginning to understand. Yes, because someone has to. Because the alternative, letting gene seed be lost because we're too sentimental to harvest efficiently, is worse than any personal guilt. Because we're not individuals anymore. We're a genetic legacy wearing armor and pretending to be people. We're walking gene seed repositories whose value is measured in future potential rather than present contribution. The young apothecary was silent for a long moment, processing the horror of what awaited him. Then, how did you survive this? 300 years of making these choices. 300 years of harvesting brothers and watching them die and reducing warriors to components. I didn't survive. I just kept existing. Kept doing the job because it needed doing. kept harvesting brothers because the alternative was unthinkable, kept making the calculations and performing the extractions and filing the reports. And eventually I stopped processing the emotional weight, stopped feeling things about it beyond a distant, abstract sense of wrongness. Just executed the protocols and moved on to the next casualty. Became the machine the Codex wanted me to be. That sounds like dying inside, like losing everything that makes you human. It is. But your insides dying means your gene seed stays healthy. Your soul degrading means the chapter survives. Your humanity eroding means the genetic legacy continues. And that's what matters. That's always what matters. The individual is temporary. The gene seed is eternal. Castiel moved toward the vault's exit, his business here finished. His time as chief apothecary ended. His 3 centuries of service concluded. Soon, he'd be assigned to training duties or strategic advisory roles, positions where old apothecaries went when they were too worn down to harvest efficiently anymore. When the weight of all those deaths finally made them hesitate too long, calculate too slowly, feel too much. One more thing, he said, pausing at the threshold. They'll tell you that the brothers understand, that every Astartes knows the compact, knows that when he falls, the apothecary will prioritize gene seed over life. They'll say it's accepted, part of the culture, something we all embrace as necessary. And is it? No. It's a lie we tell ourselves to make the horror bearable. Brothers don't understand until they're dying and the apothecary positions the reductor over them instead of the narthecium, until they feel the blades cutting through armor and flesh while they're still conscious, until they realize they're being harvested like crops instead of saved like comrades. That's when they understand. And by then, it's too late to do anything except die cursing your name. Then why do we do it? Why do we maintain this system if it's based on a lie? Because the lie is necessary. Because if brothers truly understood, if they internalized that they're more valuable dead than alive, that the apothecary might let them die rather than risk losing their gene seed, they'd hesitate in battle, fight more cautiously, prioritize their own survival over mission success. And that hesitation would cost us victories, cost us campaigns, eventually cost us the chapter. Castiel stepped through the vault's entrance, the gene-locked door hissing shut behind him. So we maintain the lie. Tell brothers that the apothecary will save them if possible, that their lives matter, that they're valued as individuals and not just gene seed carriers. And then we harvest them when they fall, and we hope they die quickly enough not to realize we lied. The young apothecary stood alone in the vault, surrounded by thousands of samples, thousands of lies, thousands of brothers who died believing they'd be saved but were harvested instead. He would add thousands more over his career, would make the same choices, would become the same kind of monster Castiel had become, wearing white armor and calling it duty. Because that's what apothecaries were. Not healers, not saviors, not protectors of life. Harvesters, scavengers who measured the worth of brothers in progenoid glands and made choices no one should have to make. Who valued corpses over lives and called it preservation. Who reduced warriors to components and called it service. The machine needed them. The chapter depended on them. The genetic legacy required them. So they harvested, and they endured, and they slowly died inside while the gene seed lived on. That was the compact. That was the price. That was what it meant to be an apothecary in the Adeptus Astartes. And somewhere on some battlefield another brother was falling. Another apothecary was making the calculation. Another life was being measured against its gene seed and found wanting. The cycle continued. The harvests never stopped. The vault kept growing. And the corpses remained more valuable than the lives they used to be. So here's the question I need you to answer honestly in the comments and really think about this before you respond. If you were a space marine, and you fell wounded on a battlefield, would you want the apothecary to try to save you? Or would you want him to harvest your gene seed immediately, ensuring your genetic legacy survives even if you don't? Because that's the choice. That's the reality beneath all the propaganda. Save the individual or save the future. Preserve the warrior or preserve what he carries. There's no right answer. Just the horrible calculation that apothecaries make thousands of times across thousands of battlefields. Just the truth that in the calculus of Astartes warfare, you're worth more dead than alive. Drop your answer below. Tell me what you'd choose. And be honest, not what sounds heroic or noble, but what you'd actually want in that moment when you're bleeding out and the apothecary is deciding your fate. And if this dive into the darkest corner of Astartes culture hit you as hard as it hit me researching it, hit that like button. Let me know this is the kind of uncomfortable lore deep dive you want more of, because the galaxy is full of stories like this. Stories about the costs we don't talk about, the sacrifices that don't make the propaganda reels, the calculations that reduce heroes to resources and call it necessary. Subscribe if you want more of this. More exploration of what the Imperium actually costs. More examination of the horror underneath the glory. More truth about what it means to be Astartes when you strip away the legend and look at the biology. Thanks for sticking with me through 9,000 words of the most depressing lore in Warhammer 40k. I'll see you in the next one. The Emperor protects. But sometimes, protection means letting you die so your gene seed can create your replacements. And that, in the end, is the most honest thing anyone can say about the Adeptus Astartes. Because your corpse is often more valuable than your life. And every apothecary knows it.